We're going to respect everybody's time, and we're going to let folks who are coming in a little late just join in with us wherever we are. And welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming. We're really excited to see everybody here. I'm Kate Frankfurt. I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation. And I'm filling in tonight for Stacy Caldwell, who's our CEO, who's listening in from her sick bed. Thank you for joining our Forest Features Salon Wildfire 101. So many of us were affected by this fire season, and it was the worst on record, with 2.5 million acres burned across California. And a fire season that began 2 months earlier than usual due to the drought conditions that we've had. 3 of our state's largest wildfires occurred this year in 2021, with the Dixie and Caldor fires forcing evacuations in our neighboring counties. Now, whether you were here in the poor air quality, packing and repacking your go bag like I was, or unable to spend time in the area because of this place that you love, because of the smoke, it was a summer that I'm sure that none of us will ever forget. Before we get to Brandon and what I know will be an amazing talk, I want to get you a little bit of information about the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation. TTCF has been around for more than 23 years. And we are one of 800 community foundations in the United States. We are a grant maker, a collaborator, and convener. We connect people and opportunities, and we generate resources to build a more caring, creative, and effective community. In addition to our grant making and our local nonprofits and providing scholarships to our local students, we focus specific attention to initiatives such as family strengthening through our community collaborative of Tahoe Truckee, our local housing crisis through our Mountain Housing Council, and forest health through Forest Futures. Climate-focused grant making is something we've been doing for more than 10 years through our Nature Fund, and we're very proud to have distributed more than $1 million to support local projects. For the past 4 years, TTCF has convened experts to help deepen our own understanding of wildfire, and we are proud to announce the launch of our Forest Futures Initiative. This bold, entrepreneurial, and holistic impact strategy identifies, builds, accelerates, and scales the solutions we need to help protect our community from catastrophic wildfire. Our Forest Futures Salons, this is one of them, have been integral in shaping that strategy, and we're excited to launch our Wildfire 101 series as we work to build community engagement on this important issue. So with that, I want to introduce Teal Zimmering, Senior Advisor to Forest Futures, who has been integral in the development of our strategy and our salons. Teal, we are so grateful for your partnership and for your expertise, and thanks for kicking us off tonight.
Thank you, Kate, so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and such a pleasure to see not only so many familiar faces, but so many that are new. And to see that rolling in through the chat, all of the places you're dialing in from, and all of the work, expertise, and incredible dedication that's represented by the folks here today. So thank you for being here. We are privileged today to have Brandon Collins with us, a fire ecologist from UC Berkeley and the U.S. Forest Service. Brandon, thank you for being here. Much of his research is intended to be applied to inform forest management. Sorry for the train. I live in Truckee, if you can hear it. And aimed at improving resiliency in forests. And so we'll hear today a little bit of Wildfire 101, a little bit of how and what happens inside the fires that we've seen and that Kate just spoke about, and Brandon's current active areas of research: stand development, recovery following fuel reduction, fire severity patterns, changes over time. So Brandon, we're really looking forward to this. Later in the conversation, we'll have time for Q&A, so please gather up your questions, drop them in the chat, or send them to me. We will call on you so that your own voices are heard when you have a question to share. And I am so excited now to turn it over to you, Brandon, to share your screen.
Okay. Thanks, Teal, and thanks, Kate, for having me. I'm happy to share this. Let me get this thing queued up. Let's see if we can. Okay, do you see my first slide?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, so I think where I want to start, I guess, is just give you a a brief overview, I suppose, of where I'm headed. What I wanted to convey was kind of the scale and some of the impacts of the current wildfires that we've seen, and you know, they kind of are off the charts, if you will, at least even relative to the recent past. And so I want to talk about some of the implications of that, and sort of emphasize that these don't appear to just be one-offs, that these fires, Dixie and so forth, Caldor, as Kate mentioned, they seem to be part of a trend, and a trend that is not, you know, that hasn't really been sort of continuously increasing, but we've hit some kind of a jump, I suppose, a real step function, if you will, in the way that these fires are burning. So ultimately, I guess what would be the hope is it's kind of a call to action, if you will. I mean, I think it's time that you know, we've all been, to some extent, you know, focused on forest restoration, I imagine, interested in it, but I think, you know, if anything else that I can convey to you from this talk is that it is time, the time is now, and it is to do this at a meaningful scale almost as quickly as possible. Okay, so first slide, this is the Dixie Fire, or a part of the very large Dixie Fire. And I took this only about a month ago. And it's in an area that had been burned in a previous wildfire, the 2007 Moonlight Fire. This is an area west of Antelope Lake, if any of you know that, on the Plumas National Forest. And it's just interesting to, you know, just to look at this contrast here. We're looking at two different management strategies following the 2007 fire. On the left side, the nearer part of the picture is on Forest Service ground. There wasn't a whole lot of activity done. Following the 2007 fire, it was severe in both areas, basically taking out much of the overstory. And then, you know, you can see the two different strategies sort of play out in the foreground is kind of a no management, you know, scenario, I guess, where we did not salvage and did not plant and did not deal with competing vegetation. And then you're looking at private forest land further off, where they did salvage, they did replant, and then they did do some vegetation control. And it's just to point out the fact that our, you know, we do have an influence on some of these fires. You know, these strategies, these two different strategies that you're looking at here, actually produce different results in, you know, in this Dixie Fire in very short spatial, you know, in very short space, I guess. And so I guess the point that I want to get across is that we can have an influence on some of the patterns of these fires. I know that they're giant and that they seem to be out of control, but nonetheless, our management strategies can have an effect. So I want to actually really start by going way back into some old data on wildfires that we sort of discovered. Actually, I didn't. It was a colleague of mine, Jay Miller, who used to work for the Forest Service out of McClellan. And this was in an archive that was sitting in the Reading lab of the Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. And what it contained is essentially a census of all fires that occurred in or immediately adjacent to national forest land from 1911 to 1924. And each line in this ledger was a fire for which, you know, a series of different data were collected on: the size, the cause, the type, vegetation type it was burning in, and so forth. And it really was a neat opportunity to sort of compare, you know, past fire patterns, you know, across this landscape. I'll show you what it is in a second, to contemporary fire patterns. And I should preface that by saying that in this case, contemporary fire patterns actually were only up until 2015, of which we seem to have departed even from that in recent years. So the area encompassed by that historical data that was up in the Reading PSW lab represents the blue sort of diagonal slash marks. That's most of the mixed conifer region in Northern California. It extends from the Sierra Nevada, the southern tip of the Sierra Nevada, going up from the Southern Cascades and over into the Klamath. So a really pretty comprehensive, like I said, census of fires from that early period. Now, that period, by the way, is not any proxy of some, historical sort of naturalness by any means. We call it the early suppression period because we know that there was timber harvesting going on at that period in time, and there absolutely was fire suppression going on. But it was early in that period, and so we think some of the impacts of, of fire suppression and of logging were not fully realized yet, as they are now. So kind of a neat comparison, but remember, we're not sort of, we're not thinking that was the natural state for these forests. But it nonetheless covered a very large area. We were able to match that area with contemporary fire records, at least, they were contemporary a few years ago. And we essentially did a comparison of how much fires had changed in that period from 1911 to 24 to this, similar period of 02 to 2015. And just to summarize a lot of data in a couple bar graphs, what we're looking at here is the proportion or percent of total area burned in each time period by fire size class. So in the gray bars, and we'll just focus on the top, by the way, so we're separated out human-caused fires and lightning-caused fires. But in the gray bars, that's from that early suppression period, and then the black is what was the contemporary period when we did this study. And one of the things that really stands out is out here in this largest fire size class, and that is fires that were greater than 30,000 acres. So in that early suppression period, we had a pretty small amount of the total area burned in those largest fire sizes. Whereas now, we're pushing nearly 80%, a little over 70% of the total area burned in really large fires, was almost nothing in the smaller size classes. Now, a similar pattern existed for lightning-caused fires, although not nearly as much, just in that large fire size class. But interestingly, there was nothing in the historical data set that was a lightning-caused fire that was anything close, that was in that 30,000 acre fire size class. So the thing here that stands out is that we, as you're probably aware of, have very large fires, right? And what comes with the large fires is generally higher proportions of high severity fire. And I'll show you maps of what I'm talking about, but essentially high severity fire is where you lost a lot of the overstory trees, and essentially you're starting over. If you're able to, oftentimes the management response would be to replant trees and sort of start with a young forest, but oftentimes we aren't able to do that. And oftentimes these areas that burn at high severity tend to turn into shrubs, and I'll show you a few slides of that. But the point here being is that this shift from what was smaller fires in that historical period to much larger fires is partly our own doing, and that is because we put out all the fires that are generally occurring under sort of moderate or less than extreme conditions. And in a way, we almost manage for just the large fires, because those are the ones that escape, and those are the ones that affect the largest amount of area. So by putting out fires when we that are burning under moderate conditions, we essentially constrain fire to only burn under the extreme conditions. So that's something that worth keeping in mind. We don't have to go into that. So let me talk about this area. I mentioned this before because this is that first slide I showed you, that area around Antelope Lake on the Plumas National Forest. And there were a series of fires that burned there in the early 2000s. And at that time, that was some of the more extensive high severity fire that we'd seen throughout the Sierras. And they were kind of seen as a one-off, these suite of fires that happened there. Up here, where was called the Moonlight Fire in 2007. This was the Antelope Complex, also in 2007, and then a couple smaller fires, the Stream Fire and the Boulder Fire. And the reason I'm showing these is that at that time when these fires occurred, it was kind of eye-opening, but I think again, we were able to discount it a little bit and say, wow, that was really extreme, but we're not going to see that everywhere. And in a way, what I'll show you in a bit is that these are now being dwarfed. What was these mega fires, so to speak, and that term wasn't even around in the early 2000s. What was that? We have blown that away by almost an order of magnitude. And just so I'm clear, or so you're clear, what these maps are showing, the red is that high severity area that I spoke about before. And you can kind of see here, you know, in the foreground, particularly in this 2001 stream fire, high severity is basically where all of the dominant trees have been killed by fire. And you can see there's quite a bit of area among these, you know, 4 fires that was high severity. And in fact, about 50% of that total area burned across those fires burned at high severity. And you can imagine, so it's not just the loss of trees, right? It's the loss of cover in those forests that then allowed perhaps for impacts to the watershed, you know, you name it. I mean, think about impacts to wildlife habitat. So it's not just the trees themselves, but the suite of characteristics that we kind of look to these forests to provide, they're all affected by high severity fire. Here's another example of a fire. This was a fire that occurred later in a slightly different area on the Plumas National Forest. This was the Chips Fire of 2012. The unique thing about the Chips Fire, at least at that time, was some of the sizes of some of the patches of high severity. So the overall amount of high severity fire, which is captured in the red here, was not particularly high. It was in the 20s, you know, maybe 25% or so of that fire, of a fire that was only, you know, about 75,000 acres. About 25% of it was high severity. But what was so significant is how big some of these patches were. And on top of that, what is also being shown in this map are what are called protected activity centers for the California spotted owl. This fire took out a number of those protected activity centers that were very productive spots in terms of, you know, just the amounts of reproduction that was going on with California spotted owls. So on top of some of the other impacts I mentioned before, I mean, you know, this was a direct impact to habitat. And once the areas are affected by high severity fire, they're not very useful from the standpoint of California spotted owls, particularly at the scale of, that we saw here in terms of the size of high severity patches. So number of impacts, reasons to be concerned about high severity fire. So here's what it looks like 10 years later, and that's not from that fire per se. This is from another fire in the same area. But in general, in the absence of post-fire management, we tend to see a strong response of shrubs following high severity fire. Now, the larger those patches are, the less likely it is that trees are going to be able to establish in those patches because they're too far away from seed source. Our trees in the Sierras don't have a direct sort of adaptation to responding to high severity fire. They don't resprout. They don't regenerate from closed cones, as is the case in some areas that are more adapted to high severity fire, Northern Rockies, Canada, and so forth. We don't have those adaptations. So our forests rely on seed that is blown in from areas where there's live trees adjacent to these high severity patches. Well, the larger the patches, you can imagine you're well away from a seed source. So the only likely transition to vegetation is really for shrubs to take hold. And that's very common. We've seen this in many fires, you know, throughout the Sierras, and even to the point now where many of these areas are starting to reburn under short intervals. And that's what I showed you in that first picture, was an area that burned in 2007, and then 14 years later in the Dixie Fire, it burned again at high severity, and it looked more or less like this. This is an area where there's incredible continuity of fuel. If you can think about vegetation or shrubs as fuel, right? When a fire comes under fairly, you know, droughty conditions, that's all very available to burn, and in fact can burn very intensely. It's particularly as it's, you know, accompanied with those downed trees or the logs or the standing snags, and then the associated down logs that you probably don't see in this picture. So we've seen that again, and let me go back to that map. This is the map that I showed you before from that Antelope Lake area, those fires 2001 to 2007. Here's what Dixie did on top of that area. And it's pretty clear that in many of these areas that burned at high severity, like here, for example, burned at high severity in 2007, burns at high severity again when it reburns. And it's quite common. We've seen this in a number of fires. And what also happens is that we're seeing these patches of high severity actually grow. They're pushing out from the existing boundaries of the high severity patch from the previous fire. They're actually growing, you know, bigger, which is even more, it's pushing that seed source further away. So here's another example. Again, I showed this to you before. Here's what Dixie did over it, right? It's almost hard to, sorry, the colors are almost too much. You can't really distinguish early high severity from repeat high severity. But just thinking about it cumulatively on that landscape, one that was quite rich and productive with regard to spotted owls, you have quite a bit of area now that was in this protected format for owls that has now been affected by high severity fire and is no longer functional habitat for California spotted owls. So there's lots of reasons to be concerned about not only high severity, but the fact that it's reburning at high severity. Here's another example of a reburn. Almost seems like old news now. This is the campfire from 2018 that burned into Paradise. Well, the campfire started somewhere around here in Polga and really got running out of the North Fork of the Feather River in some previous high severity patches from a 2008 suite of fires. What's below, you're seeing this outline here, this light, this purple outline with the light shading, that's the perimeter of the campfire. Underneath it is the severity of fires from 2008. And like I said, this is that area where the fire really got up and running, and then it caught that wind that blew it right into Paradise. So lots of reasons to be concerned about high severity fire, its impacts on resources, and its impacts to us potentially from a reburn standpoint. So the question then is why? Why are we here? How did we get to this spot? And essentially, it's a relatively simple story. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to it, but to simplify sort of the change that we've seen in forests, they're really from a couple of different practices. One is our elimination of fire. We've done that in several different ways. We've had organized fire suppression for many decades, over 100 years now. We've also had fire exclusion, where we've removed intentional ignitions, largely Native American ignitions. And then we've also had large-scale grazing. The grazing itself has not terribly impacted the forest, except for to take away some of the continuity and fine fuels and further contribute to that elimination of fire. So those three things together, we've really taken fire out of what was a fire adapted, and even many people have argued a fire maintained forest condition historically. Now, on top of that, we've also done many decades of timber harvesting, and largely harvesting that was focused on removing the largest trees. A lot of people think that the harvesting that went on in many of our California forests were all clear cuts, and there were definitely some clear cuts, but more so, I would imagine, on the coast than in some of these mixed conifer forests, where we were actually more focused on taking out the largest trees because those were the ones that were most commercially valuable. Now, in doing so, you're taking out the trees that are probably the most resistant to fire, right? Those are the trees with the thickest bark. They're very tall, and their crowns are off the ground. So the combination of pulling fire out of these forests and then pulling out the biggest trees, we've really changed the character of these forests. And I'll show you some data that kind of demonstrates that. Another historical data source that we found, this was an inventory that was conducted in 1911 across a large portion of the Stanislaus National Forest. And it was great. It was super quantitative for us. This is what you're looking at here are tallies of trees by 2-inch diameter classes, by species, here, yellow pine, sugar pine, white fir, and cedar, and then also by height. These individual columns are actually the different heights of trees. So a very explicit inventory, which we then were able to locate because it was based on the public land survey system, essentially, township range, section, quarter section, even quarter section. And we had an idea of where those surveys were conducted. They were done in strips right through the middle of quarter sections, and we were able to put plots along those same areas. We didn't, there were no permanent markers, so we don't know exactly that we were in the same spot, but we were pretty darn close. So we did a survey, we did some sampling. In fact, we weren't able to complete all of the sampling. We would have liked to have gotten to all of these white squares. These are all quarter sections where those data sheets were available. But if any of you know this area, this is where the rim fire happened in 2013, and we didn't finish our sampling because of the rim fire. Nonetheless, we got quite a bit of data for a really nice comparison of historical conditions from 1911 to at the time 2013 was the contemporary sort of remeasurement. And to boil it down into a few lines of a table, the essential change that we saw was obviously a major increase in forest density. Now, kind of depicting that with these pictures, these are not repeat photographs, they're just trying to demonstrate what the data are showing. So we kind of measure density in two different ways, one of which is basal area. It's essentially the cross-sectional area of tree per square or per acre or per hectare. So that actually accounts for larger trees. If you have larger trees, your basal area will go up almost exponentially. And then another way we can do it is just by a simple tree count. And in this case, it's just the count of trees that are over 6 inches in diameter. And we have that for the historical condition and for the contemporary condition. Now, if you look at the basal area column, we see essentially a doubling of basal area from that 1911 period to present. Now that's kind of interesting, knowing that this area had been harvested, and harvested, several times. It wasn't just one time. We think that there were several entries where the big trees were repeatedly removed. Yet we still saw a doubling of basal area. So these are productive forests that can grow trees. But what was keeping these forests at such low density as is being shown here on the left were those repeated fires. We actually have a lot of evidence from reconstructions of fire occurrence that fire happened about every 5 to 10 years in these forests. And it really maintained generally a low density condition, but almost to the point where it really took away some of the productivity, the potential of, for these areas to grow timber essentially. And so early foresters really argued that we needed to put fires out in order to sort of maximize the potential of these lands. And we did a very good job at that. And we actually were able to have these stands grow a bunch of timber. And we did that many extractions over many decades, but we kind of have been left with the aftermath of those decisions over many decades. And essentially we have a forest condition now that is oftentimes described as an overstocked stand. But the real issue is that we have way too many small trees, not enough big trees, way too much fuel on the forest floor, and then in general, just way too much connectivity. If you think about fire moving either on the ground or in the tree crowns here, it's almost impossible for fire to move from tree crown to tree crown here because there's so much open space between trees. There might be clumps of trees where you could see local torching, but it would be very difficult to get fire to propagate in the tree crowns in this historical condition. In this condition, not a problem at all for fire to move, not only vertically, but horizontally within the tree crowns. Here's another bit of data that we have, also doing this historical to contemporary comparison. This was at a much smaller spatial scale. This was an area about 10 acres where every single tree was mapped. And it was done as part of a study that was to look at different methods for harvesting at the time. So this map was actually created before this area was ever harvested in 1929. And then we were able to go back and remap the same area in 2008 after harvesting, after, of course, many, many decades of fire suppression. And what you can see just kind of, by visual comparison of these is that one, we've lost a lot of these large trees, right? The size of the dot itself, and then the size of the sort of bluish circle around each dot is the approximated size of a tree crown. So this right here is an extremely large sugar pine, and it's coded by species. If you can see, corresponding species on the lower legend. So these really large trees are gone. There's nothing even close to it over here. I mean, perhaps that's a fairly large tree, but it's not nearly as big as that one. Another feature that's missing from the contemporary condition are these blobs here. Now, why are these blobs unique? These are gaps that are large enough to allow for reproduction of what are called shade-intolerant species. And that's largely our Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine, sugar pine species. And they require a certain amount of light in order to regenerate and grow successfully. Well, those conditions are almost entirely absent from the current condition. There's no way that we can really regenerate pine successfully in the understory in the current condition. So we've really changed, in addition to some of what I showed you before, the changes in basal area, the changes in tree density, we've really changed the spatial properties of these forests as well. We have no gaps. We have a lot of continuity. If you think about it from the standpoint fire moving through this area. There's very little to stop it in terms of a break. And then also we've just, this very well demonstrates the shift from what was large trees to many, many small trees. So that's another data source. And in general, just to summarize what that means, this change as a result of both, our harvesting and our fire suppression, fire exclusion policies has been a massive increase in surface fuels. And that is, surface fuels are, dead needles, dead branches, small trees, shrubs in the understory. Fire repeatedly, sort of on that 5 to 15 year interval, really was able to keep surface fuels in check. If you can imagine that happening over many, many decades, hundreds of years, you really have very limited ability to accumulate. Now, we remove fire from there, and then you essentially have fairly constant deposition of fuels, but nothing except for decomposition to actually remove them from the system. So we've seen a massive increase in surface fuels. We've seen an increase in ladder fuels. Now, what are ladder fuels? Those are small trees, branches of moderate to large size trees that connect the surface fuels to the crowns of the dominant trees. Now, that allows us to actually see a lot more crown fire, a lot more torching potential in these stands. And then we've also seen an increase in crown fuels. That's just literally the density of trees and how connected those crowns are in the overstory. So in all fuel strata, we've really seen an increase, which is not surprising that we're seeing the types of fire effects that we see in some of these contemporary fires. Just to show a few examples, this is from the rim fire. This is essentially what a forest that has a lot of surface fuel, no shortage of ladder fuels, and quite a bit of connectivity in the crown. This is what it burns like on a, in a wildfire condition in sort of our typical summer condition. This was from the rim fire. This is another area that burned, same thing. You can even see ladder fuels are more accentuated even in this picture. But it's almost no surprise that we're getting the kind of fire that we're getting when you have the stand conditions that we do. Now, all that I've been focused on so far has really been the forest, and we haven't even talked about the climate piece. Now, on top of that, on top of all those changes that have increased the susceptibility of these forests to high severity fire, we have a climate that is much more conducive to fire spread. These are data from several long recording weather stations that occurred on the Tahoe National Forest going up through the Lhasa National Forest. And essentially what we're looking at here in the black lines are the percent of days in a given fire season that exceeded a high to extreme fire weather threshold. So you can see that in the 1980s and early 90s, we have very few days that actually exceeded this quote unquote extreme fire weather threshold. But as we get to the mid 90s and into the 2000s, we see more and more of these spikes happening. Now this data stopped. I think the last data that we collected were in 2012 for this. But my guess is that you would see not only, by the way, let me back up. This red line is a statistical fit running through those spikes, those peaks up and down. And essentially it was a linear trend that we saw over this time period, and a linear increase in the proportion of days that were in this high to extreme fire weather condition. My guess is that if we were to update this through the current time, that we wouldn't be on this linear trajectory anymore. We might actually be starting to bend up in a little bit more of an exponential. So the point of this is that there's much more opportunity for fire to burn under high to extreme fire weather conditions, which in conjunction with the forest conditions is really feeding some of the effects that we're seeing, these really large high severity patches, the reburning that we're seeing. So essentially the two things are working essentially to in the opposite direction of resilient conditions that we'd like to be at. So what do? We can do forest treatments. We can do mechanical treatments where we remove smaller trees, hopefully some utilization of the biomass, but more often what you're seeing lately has been just these giant burn piles, which are incredibly wasteful. They contribute to more bad air quality and so forth. We can do prescribed burning. That's been problematic. We haven't really proven that we can do that at scale, but there are some commitments that are happening in some of the agencies that they're trying to scale up. But it's the point that I'd like to get across is that it's not one or the other of these strategies. They absolutely both need to happen, and they need to happen sooner rather than later. When you see it sort of a treated condition, you know, they can be quite effective at removing surface fuels, ladder fuels, of course, if you do the mechanical removals, and then, you know, by the thinning itself, you can remove crown fuels. So sorry, I want to get through some of this just so we can get to some of the questions, but let me end with this slide here. And I want to bring a little bit of nuance to the story about historical forest conditions. I think sometimes we oversell the point that historical forests were low density. I think, you know, one of the things that we're realizing now with some of these new data sets is that variability was actually kind of a key component of historical forests. That, you know, from the standpoint of restoration, we don't need to necessarily do the same prescription everywhere. We do need to do some kind of fuels reduction, I would argue, almost everywhere, but it doesn't have to be the same thing. And in fact, doing the same thing would be quite detrimental in many conditions. The other thing I haven't really even talked about is that the change we've seen in these forests, the density increases and all that, have also increased the vulnerability to drought. And we saw that in a big way in the 2012 through 16 drought in the Southern Sierra. And I think, you know, honestly, we're not probably far off seeing something like that in the Northern Sierra as well. It's not as though the forest conditions are any different. It just happened to be that the drought was more severe in the Southern Sierra. If we got one like that in the Northern Sierra, we could very easily see mortality like what they saw. And so again, I'll just push for this idea of large-scale forest restoration, which includes fire use. Right? We absolutely need to use fire, and that means using naturally ignited fires, right? There's quite a controversy, and I imagine we can get into this in some of the discussion as to what we can do, you know, with lightning ignitions. You know, can we let them do some of the restoration for us? Now, there's a good argument for why we would want that, but there's also some cases where that's actually led to some impacts that were pretty undesirable. So in any event, we're going to have to figure out a way to use fire. If it means going in and doing mechanical work first, maybe that's what it would take. But we absolutely can't rely on mechanical treatments to do this alone. So sorry, I was a little rushed at the end, but I wanted to stop. I wanted to give you guys time for questions. So I'll stop right there, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Brandon, thank you so much. A very brief summary of everything that we just heard. Fuels increase, but perhaps an overemphasis on that. A hugely negative, trending upward line in weather patterns. Interesting, also massive variability. Previously a pretty consistent weather pattern. So these effects of climate change, drought vulnerability, species transition, ignition changes. So seeing lightning cause these large scale fires sort of for the first time. You covered a huge amount for us. And I know we have a variety of expertise and questions and backgrounds on the phone. Before we go to the collective questions, I have one for you, although someone just put the $10,000 question in the chat, so I'll have to look at that as well. But here's my question for you. If there were 3 takeaways from what you just shared with us, if there were 3 things that you wanted to leave us with, particularly those of us for whom wildfire is a 101, what would you leave us with?
Okay, well, just off the top, one is that the fires we're seeing are not merely burning in anything close to a natural condition. I think sometimes people are under the impression that, well, you know, these are fire adapted forests, so let's just let fire do its thing in these forests. And I would argue that it's what fire is doing in these forests is nothing close to what it would have done, you know, historically. And so my argument, we need to intervene. So I guess that's number one. Number two, I guess this isn't something I hit on directly, but I think it's interesting to think about some of the things that are keeping us from doing large scale restoration. And I think it's time almost that we prioritize the forest as opposed to some of the attributes of the forest or some of the associates with the forest. Because without the forest, we're kind of losing, we're going to lose all the things that we care about, habitat, some of the amenities as well. And then I guess, I don't know, I guess lastly, I think it's absolutely, you know, critical that I think more voices are heard on this subject. I feel like, there's a whole group of, fire ecology, forest management type people that have been talking about this for years, but obviously that hasn't really, tipped the balance at all in terms of making an impact. And I feel like the more, the average person, could get involved in this process, could voice their support for doing forest restoration, I think we'd be a heck of a lot better off.
Thanks, Brandon. You said something at the outset. We have the opportunity to affect these patterns. And I wrote that down, which I think is a piece of what you just re-articulated. I recently heard someone say, we have to stop thinking of humans and ecosystems as different entities. The plants and the humans rely on one another for survival and for sustenance. And so we have to engage. And I think that's kind of a similar point to what you're sharing right now, if I understand correctly.
Very much so. I completely agree. Just funny, sorry, I'll a little anecdote. So a colleague of mine, Malcolm North, we wrote a paper several years ago, and Malcolm put this line in a paper that kind of shocked me at first, but he's absolutely right. He said we have to stop thinking of fire as sort of an act of God, in these forests. They're going to burn. They've always burned, and we should almost expect that they're going to burn, and not just treat it as some emergency, I guess. And that doesn't necessarily relate to your quote, but it made me think that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the degree to which you're able to provide us with this huge amount of information in such a succinct way. There's a question in the chat that I'd love to go to kind of right off the bat, because I think it deals a little bit with this conversation of how do we engage, but also how do we restore? How do we heal? How do we engage with that part of the process? So Bob Hambrecht, if you are still around, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Well, even I'll see in the video, though, I'm probably looking pretty good right there. Yeah, I spent a lot of time actually dealing with Robert Little's question about how we're going to create, demand for the small merchantable wood, but we've been increasingly curious. Well, you show those intense burns, and then the shrubs that replace them. You did show the private land that got planted. Has there been a lot of work on how to restore those intensely burned areas? And do we need to look at cedar and other tree species that are more drought resistant? I don't know how much work's been done on that, but I'm really curious to learn more.
We haven't, you're right. I don't think it's been a ton. In fact, actually, we had a study that was in that footprint of the Moonlight Fire, which actually completely burned in the Dixie Fire. Now, it's not, I don't mean to say that the study is completely lost, but it would be really interesting to revisit those plots and see whether or not some of the reforestation strategies that we're looking at actually made an impact on the Dixie Fire itself.
Right, because if you point out if it's intensely burned and then not treated, it's just going to burn intensely again. And yeah, I wonder if there are any examples otherwise.
That much is clear. I mean, it's not, especially under the more droughty and higher fire weather conditions, it's almost a given that mix of shrubs and down logs and snags is going to reburn at high severity. And what is not entirely clear is what is the alternative. I think the standard practice on much of the private ground has been to replant at fairly high density, and then use herbicide to treat competing vegetation and so forth. And some of those areas didn't fare great in the Dixie Fire either. And I would suggest that we have to probably replant for sure, but replant at lower densities than we're probably accustomed to. And that, I know that gives up some growing space and some potential volume, but I think that's kind of what we're looking at is something that we could sustain, I think, in a reburn context.
What is a high density versus a low density in trees per acre, I guess, or whatever the number is?
We have a standard, at least had a standard prior to about a year and a half ago, at least on private ground, was to have at least 300 trees per acre on a point count basis, meaning it had to be verified by sort of a point count method, which generally meant you had to have higher than 300 trees per acre. My argument would be something in the 1 to 200 trees per acre, or something we might be able to sustain some kind of treatment of the fuels in between trees. A lot of the pushback for planting at lower densities was that shrubs would come in. And I agree, they absolutely will. We need to have some way to control those shrubs, whether it be herbicide or even fire. Fire, some of these young trees we've done some on our university forest. Rob York has done some burning in young stands, and they can withstand a bit of fire. So it's not as though you have to entirely eliminate fire. You just have to apply it fairly carefully.
Interesting. Yeah, I did visit a commercial thinning that was being done on private land, and I believe they said they had planted at 300 trees per acre, but after 20 years, they were cutting a third of the trees out because they couldn't get to harvest merchantable wood. And I think he even said, we did 300 because we thought there'd be mortality, and the mortality isn't happening the way we thought it would. So surprised to hear it's still 300, honestly.
Well, that's changed. That just changed in the forest practice rules. And I don't know what took so long, but it just changed. But I think it's now in that 1 to 200 range, depending on cycle.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I was just starting to write into the chat that when Robert wrote 300, is that a universal prescription? One of the things, Brandon, that you brought up was the need for bespoke, individualized, highly contextual prescriptions that deal with local complexity, including biodiversity, including all of the aspects of terrain and planting. So first question is that now true that you have the flexibility to do that within the Forest Service? And then I have a follow-up question to that, but I'll leave you with that one first.
Within the Forest Service, they have a different standard. They don't have that 300 trees. It has to be quote unquote fully stocked. And that does vary depending on site quality and forest type and so forth. But the reality of it is we're not, even on Forest Service ground, we're not keeping up with the amount that's being lost to high severity fire. I would guess that in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, that we're actually reforesting maybe 10% of what is being lost to high severity fire on federal land. So it's a different issue there. It's really an issue of capacity and perhaps funding. So it is, it's a different animal. It's not even that issue of the real high stocking density.
Interesting, thank you. My sort of tack on top of that I think might be interesting to bring up, given that we are a community foundation and sitting in a community of practitioners right here on the phone, that I noticed that Nancy Wallace from the Watershed Council and Scott from Land Tender are here. And I'm wondering if you might just briefly share how you're thinking about direct prescriptions for individual landscapes and how you're thinking about a piece of this problem, Scott or Nancy. Scott, if you're up for my calling on you, which I warned you about, so hopefully you're up for it.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Brandon, good to see you, by the way. So yeah, and so just folks know that we are working through the Watershed Council to really focus on a strategy. And I'll be clear that there's a difference between strategy and tactics. And it's really easy to get kind of caught up in both and sit in the middle. We're focused on a strategy for the Middle Truckee River watershed. And what that means is we've kind of approached this from a very siloed landscape where the Forest Service does their thing, the private does their thing, Truckee Fire kind of helps here and there. But it's not alone in Truckee. It hasn't worked very well, and it partly is we're not doing enough, but also are we doing what we have, going to the right places and generating a multi-jurisdictional strategy that everybody can agree to that can kind of get to that Pareto effect, right? And the Pareto effect is if you can treat 20%, can you accumulate 80% of the effect? So that's really what we're focused on right now for the Middle Truckee, is generating this comprehensive multi-jurisdictional strategy that we can all kind of agree to and focus on. And then we get into the tactics a little bit more. Now, with that said, the strategy needs to be specific enough that it hands off to the tactics. So you have an idea of, well, this is going to likely be thinning. This is going to likely be mastication, a whole host of other treatments. But ultimately, the strategy has to be tied with the tactics with data, but boots on the ground are ultimately going to deal with the actual prescriptions that get to that historical range of variability that Brandon talked about.
Scott, thank you so much. Speaking of prescriptions, well, before I ask this next question and turn to Jeffrey for your question, Brandon, do you want to comment on what Scott just shared?
I agree with what Scott said. I like that approach. I would almost push back though and say that notion of 20% of the landscape is almost passé now. And the reason I say it is that our fire behavior models are not even close to being able to capture the types of fire that we saw, for example, this summer in Caldor and Dixie. And that 20% number was really developed on those fire behavior models, which are outdated. And so what I would almost say is we need to be going towards a strategy essentially that has some type of fuels objective on every acre of land. Now, again, I know that's out there. It's not something that's feasible. I mean, right now we can't just flip a switch and do it. But I ultimately think that's the strategy we need to go for, because one, we know these forests are incredibly departed, but two, just the continuity that we have, the ability to generate so much energy within these fires, and then they can sort of be self-reinforcing, is something that is way outside of our modeling capability. I honestly think we need to go full speed on forest restoration. That 20% thing is kind of an old. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure it applies.
Well, I just meant that the idea is you want to generate the biggest return on your investment. And I wasn't saying just do 20% and we're good, but you have to be strategic. We can't just everybody do their own thing and hope it works out. Is really where I was going at.
I mean to correct you on that one. I was kind of speaking more broadly.
Brandon and I are aligned, even though it sounds like we're arguing.
We are.
Thank you so much. There's a number of questions rolling in, both to me directly and in the chat. So we might do a little bit of a rapid fire with some of them. One that I received directly, which I think follows up a little bit, Scott and Brandon, on what you were just sharing, which is kind of a high level question. How much do competing needs, plans, and management theories lead to the problem we're facing right now?
From what I can tell, what we're dealing with is a big time bottleneck on sort of our I guess competing resource objectives is probably the best way to say it. Right, we have a lot of measures in place to protect certain resources, right? Water courses, of course, right? We want to protect water courses. Wildlife habitat for declining, wildlife populations. We want to protect that. Rare species, rare plant species, and so on. You name it. You go down the list, and by the time you start to carve up an actual landscape with all those different things, you're left with these slivers, essentially. I mean, that's maybe an overstatement, but you're left with pretty discrete polygons across a given landscape. And my argument would be that like I was trying to say, it's almost like we need to boil forest back up to the top. Without the forest, if we keep seeing more and more go up at high severity, all those other things that we have are completely affected by that. Water courses, wildlife habitat, rare plants. Some rare plants may be adapted to high severity fire, but it's very much an internal problem that we have put all these other things as priorities above the actual forest.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that and highlight that one way to get around that a little bit is to measure the benefits and co-benefits of treatments. Instead of just saying, hey, we thin just to protect structures, that's one thing, but we also thin to improve forest resilience. We also thin to improve some biodiversity. We thin for carbon sequestration. So measuring all those things and accumulating the benefits and co-benefits and quantifying it so everybody can see it is bringing everybody together in that same show. Because Brandon's right. What happens is everybody pulls their little thread and say, I don't care what you do outside of arc sites. I don't care what you do outside of alpacs. And then all of a sudden you're left with nothing to do except these in-between slivers that does nothing. So it's a matter of agreeing that, hey, we have a bigger purpose and let's measure the benefits because it's not just about protecting our structures.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. We have two questions that are rather particular, specific about the treatments and the treatment opportunities. And then we have questions coming in from the phone as well. So this is excellent. And I think the first one will go to Jeffrey. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great.
Hi, Brandon. I'm a registered professional forester, and I've worked in the area for almost 48 years. So I have an extensive background with both the private sector, and I worked for CAL FIRE for 20, most of it out of the Truckee office. Do you think that the defense zones should be increased beyond a quarter mile for the Forest Service's prescription?
that depends on what your larger strategy is, right? If your strategy is honestly to insulate, you know, the homes and then, you know, not do something in the wildlands, then I suppose, yeah, I mean, expand the defense zone. But my argument, I guess, against that would be that we need a landscape strategy that actually has relevance to affecting, you know, fire in communities as well. We're seeing the types of fire we saw this, you know, this summer, the spread we saw in Dixie. You know, some of the impacts to homes originated well outside of the WUI, outside of the defense zone, threat zone, whatever you want to call it. It was way the heck out there. And so a true strategy, a landscape strategy, I think would, you know, incorporate that potential for fire to transmit from the quote unquote wildlands to the WUI. So I guess I just don't really like that strategy of the threat zone, defense zone, and then the wildlands.
I completely agree. And I think we need to revisit the idea of where the heaviest fuel concentrations exist. And if they're in the wilderness areas, we need to put fire in the wilderness areas, and we need to do it now, not wait 10 years to try to do it. So I'm with you. I think that that's really good advice. And I think what Scott's saying is a great idea. We do need to collect the data, and we need to get some measure of agreement, but I don't think we're all going to agree on how it's going to best play out to affect all species all the time. But I do think that we're in a crisis right now in terms of watching communities burn when we could take proactive measures to prevent it.
Yeah, that brings up a really good point. Sorry, Teal, I'll take a minute only. One of the things I think that we don't really capture for those of us that aren't in that fire, the immediate sort of wildfire environment, a lot of people would be shocked at how much manipulation goes on inside these fires. You know, all the dozer line that's constructed, all the harvesting, there is a massive amount of timber harvesting that goes on with no planning whatsoever in a wildfire environment. Now, it's not necessarily being realized, it's not brought to a mill, it's oftentimes stacked, and who knows, maybe it's never gotten to. But it's crazy that we can do so much manipulation under an emergency, you know, context. But as Jeffrey was saying, why we can't have that similar urgency on the front end, you know, from a prevention standpoint. I mean, there's a major disconnect right there.
I'll add that I call good treatment dozer line prevention, because it's a much more amenable effects than a 6-blade wide dozer line. That anybody's seen pictures around Myers, that's exactly what they put in, about 6 blades with nothing but dirt.
So speaking of burning, deep in the forest or otherwise, Ash, you had a question specifically about burn windows. If you still have your question, go ahead and unmute yourself. And I neglected to mention this before, but if you can just briefly state your affiliation before you ask your question, I think that would be helpful and valuable for all of us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Teal and Brandon. Thanks so much for a wonderful overview of what's happening in our forests. So I'm Ash. I'm the manager of Sage Creek Field Station, which is just north of Truckee, and we are involved in a few projects where we're thinning and burning, and we're implementing different strategies. So I really like that you highlighted the need for heterogeneous and variable strategies. One thing we've really come up against, though, is the burn windows have been so small the last few years. We've burned 4 acres out of a goal of 5,000 acres in the last 2 years, or 1,500 acres. Either way, it's a really small percent. But I was just wondering, like, if you had any thoughts about how we can move forward with these, like, different logistics, and how we can actually continue to use these different strategies even when one might be the most efficient given our current resources or climate.
That's a really good point, Ash. It is. That's one of the things that is why I can't get on board with people that are like, we're just going to burn more and we'll deal with the problem. It's just not realistic, honestly. I mean, we absolutely need to do as much burning as possible. You know, we need to take advantage of the windows that are not necessarily your typical windows. I think in the wintertime, we've had some windows in particular that, you know, actually, you know, without snow, that are pretty decent opportunities to burn, but we don't have the staffing to actually do any burning then. That's kind of a problem. That's something we could actually could change with staffing. But I'm so hesitant to say burning is the answer alone here, because we just haven't proven that we can get over the hump. And another thing, you know, even outside of the burn windows, and their problem on their own right. Smoke is, there was so much smoke load on people this summer. I don't think they're going to be thrilled about taking more smoke from prescribed fires in the fall, just because they want to breathe some clean air for some time in the year. And we are just in a tough position right now. I think we need to be as creative as possible, but again, it is both burning and mechanical, full speed as much as possible.
Cool, thank you.
Ash, welcome to the Truckee community, if I'm not mistaken. You are somewhat newly leading the Sage Hen Creek Field Station work, and it's such a remarkable place and asset and resource for our community. So welcome, and I'm so thrilled you're here. So thank you for that question. We have a couple more questions coming in. Bob, I'm just going to go ahead and ask your friend Josh on the phone his question for you, which is about whether there are ways to prevent the bush regrowth that you discussed, Brandon. Josh's question is a little further up here. Josh's question is about whether there are ways to put wood chip or hay or other things on the ground that would have a beneficial ecosystem service and also prevent that regrowth.
We haven't seen it yet. I mean, I'm not saying we've exhausted, the potential for doing treatments like that, but at least, at the scales we're talking about, with patches of high severity fire in the thousands to some in the couple, tens of thousands of acres, I'm just not sure that that's entirely realistic. And I'm not sure how effective it is. The old strategy of reseeding by helicopter or something like that, that has proven pretty ineffective, because all it takes is one big rainstorm and all those seeds end up in the drainage and then down into a creek. And I would imagine something similar, like that with just some mulch or something. I guess mulch might do a little better holding on, but man, that would be a massive endeavor. And I'm still not sure it would retard the growth or the establishment of shrub species. It's incredible how quickly and how vigorously the shrubs can take advantage of a recently burned site.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all those who are filling the chat with so much expertise. I want to offer for everybody to jump in there and share your affiliations and some of the work that you do as well. It's a good place to connect with one another, and I'm happy to see all of that coming in. As we, at this moment, sort of consider all of the many topics that we've covered today, we just have a few more minutes left together, and I'll leave a moment for questions that might arise right now. And if not, I have one final question for you, Brandon. So are there others who have questions at this point? And please feel free to either raise your hand or simply unmute yourself.
Hey, Brandon, Robert Little, registered professional forester in El Dorado County. In order to achieve this pace and scale, the big question comes, do you need wood products infrastructure to be increased in California in order to make this happen? Because we're not going to prescribe burn or pilot in place our way out of this problem. And then when you compound with our policymakers are really pushing us towards an energy system where we're going to rely on electricity more and more, and we're moving away from fossil fuels, it seems very obvious that perhaps we adopt the Scotland model, which I believe 80% of their energy production is wood sourced. And we're all going to have to, I believe, answer the question about whether or not wood, especially from forests, should be considered a form of green energy, because it is a renewable resource. And on par with solar and wind, I think we're going to get to a point where we need to develop that infrastructure and the policy that supports it.
100% agree on that one. We absolutely need to do something with the biomass. I think it's, as Scott mentioned before, there are many other co-benefits as well. It's not just the fact that you can generate electricity, or the fact that there's jobs associated with it, or the fact that there's fire hazard reduction, but it's also water, right? We potentially could see more water yield, less drought stress. There's so many other things connected to this utilization piece. It just makes me mad that we can't connect those dots, from a policy standpoint, in a way sort of monetize that, because it would absolutely pencil out.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Robert. So as we close out today's discussion, I'm going to ask one more question. We'll then go back to Kate for a few final comments today. Brandon, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I'll leave you with quite a simple question, which is, you mentioned to us, oh, did someone just say something? Okay. You mentioned to us the three things that you thought were the overarching takeaways from your presentation earlier. We've then gone deeper into prescribed burns, the challenge and the need, into how we deal with prescriptions for both regrowth and prescriptions for either thinning or burning. And I'm wondering if we think about community education, what it is that we need to know as community members of a region. In addition to what you shared with us before, which is you can engage and you must engage, is there something about the education that you think is the most critical piece for us to understand? So if we go out and we share stories and we tell the Tahoe Truckee region more about what's happening in our forests, what would you say is the education message for us to understand to enable us to be outspoken and to do what you called us to do, which is to engage?
I guess, it's a two-part response to that. One is we can change the patterns of these fires, by doing some management of the fuels, of the forest densities and all that. I think that often, the story has been told as though these are entirely a climate phenomenon, a climate change phenomenon. And there's some truth to that. But my point would be that we can, with managing fuels, we can change the types, of fire that we see. And not only that, we can do that in a way that is within the ecological framework of these forests anyway. It's kind of it's not as though doing these fuels treatments are counter to the ecology. They're completely consistent with the ecology. So it's almost it's an easy piece for us, to accept, I think, and to move forward with. Now, Southern California is a different story. Dealing with fire problems in chaparral is not, you don't have that alignment with fuels management and the ecology, but we have it, and I just think we need to absolutely take advantage of that.
Thank you so much. There is a huge amount for us to take away. And though I quoted it before, I think I want to say it again, which is the first thing you said, Brandon. We have the opportunity to affect these patterns. And I think a number of ways to do that came up today, but also a number of patterns that need to be affected came up today. So thank you for covering such a broad breadth of information and for giving us such depth at the same time. Really appreciate your being here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kate.
Who has to unmute herself in order to be able to be heard. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Teal. Thank you, Brandon, for a really fascinating discussion. I think, this topic is so confusing to so many of us sort of, in the community who see it happening, who don't really understand what we're seeing, why we're seeing it, what can be done, and just so desperately wanting to do something. And so this kind of information and this kind of education, I feel, is so important for all of us so that we can really start to target our efforts and make our voices known, but also really to sort of understand what it is that we're living through, in these days. And so I think this has been really helpful, and I appreciate that. And our Forest Futures work here at the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation really has been a collaborative effort of just these kinds of discussions over the course of the past 4 years, and has really informed the strategy that we are putting forward, which I really think, does touch on many of the things that you've mentioned today. It's a very complex issue. There's not one solution to it, but it's really going to take a holistic and multi-pronged approach and partnering with our local organizations. So I was really so glad to see folks from the Watershed Council and others on this in this discussion tonight. So the next discussion that we're going to have as we continue this Wildfire 101 series, which is really meant to help us to, as a community, start to engage in the discussion and learn more so that we can be more active participants in making sure that what happens here is what needs to happen here. November 10th will be our next Wildfire 101, again from 4 to 5:15, November 10th. And it's going to be on Dixie, Carr, and Caldor fires, what just happened and what happens now. And so in that discussion, we're going to be speaking with folks, including CAL FIRE Unit Chief Brian Estes on this year's devastating California fires. We're going to learn about the decisions that were made and what this winter may mean for recovery and restoration. I don't know, many of the folks on the call are way more expert than I, but if you are like I am and just learning, I thought, oh, good, fire season's over. Here comes the rain and the snow, yay. But in fact, on all of those devastating burn scars from those very horrible wildfires of just this past season, lots and lots of rain and lots of snow make things very complicated. And so just even learning about that, I think, shifts the needle in our understanding of what we experience on a day-to-day. So thank you, everybody. I hope we'll see you again on November 10th. Thanks for joining us, and good night.